This video is just to show the various parts of the knife, which have been shown in other videos, but this will perhaps clarify the way that it works in terms of the layers. So this is the first layer. It has the hex nut recesses on this side. If I had my time again, I'd have brought everything a little bit inboard. I think there is room, and it would just be able to machine and be able to have slightly curved corners and things, but anyway, it is what it is. So that's layer one, marked by the one dot. Layer two is the first latch layer, and you can probably just see there that I've added epoxy to the corners to make the shape better, to retain the catch plate better. The catch plate tended to, it was pushed by the slider at the top of the plate, but wanted to release the blade 2 layers down, and it was sort of skew-if. It wasn't moving parallel top and bottom because the pocket was too loose. So the epoxy kind of sorted that out. So that's the bottom layer of the catches. It's also the takes one of the blade spigots, this blade spigot, and this stops the blade falling out at the end. That's the way the blade exits or deploys. This is the final blade, and this was the blank blade in aluminium, which I used just to work out how everything would work, how I would pressure fit the spigots and so forth. So then layer 3 is the steel layer. I've just painted the edges, pretty poor job actually. Painted the edges because steel will tend to corrode and rust, and I need to just take the extra paint off the inside. So that's the only layer with an open end, which is where the blade emerges. You can see that this pocket's got 2 dots, and this pocket's got 1 dot, and they match up with the dots on the actual latch blades. And then the knife then goes into that layer. There's a tiny little dot on the knife. It's hard to drill, so a tiny little dot which goes adjacent to those dots, but there's only one way you can put it in because the spigots are offset, and the reason they're offset is that the spring needs to come down this side, the spring assembly, and then the button goes back on this side as well, I think. You can see the notch in the blade here that engages this pocket when it's shut, so it doesn't fall out the knife when it's shut, and when it's open, the back of the blade comes there, and this latch engages the back of the blade to stop it pushing in when it's out, to lock it out when it's out. And this notch here is where the puller arm engages. So you see the puller arm engages in the back of the blade to pull the blade out, but the other puller arm that pulls the blade in engages with this spigot here, and we'll see that later on. So effectively the one puller arm needs to be longer than the other. So that's the blade. Level 4 takes the top spigot on the blade, it guides it, and again we've got the pockets with the dots. Layer 5 is the slider layer. If you look carefully, you'll see that this line is slightly different. This line is offset from this line, and this line is offset from this line, and that's because the slider fits in like that with its dots, with its 5 dots adjacent to the 5 dots there. So the slider fits in there, and you can see the way the geometry works here, so that when the slider comes back, it dislodges the latch, and when the slider comes forward, it releases the latch. And there's steel inserts here and here to so that the steel of the latch doesn't wear away on the steel of the aluminium of the slider. This is a repair I did when I did slider Mark II. I filled it with epoxy because I didn't want to have to make another one of these with all the inserts and everything. So when I made slider number 2, so I noticed the slider was in the wrong position laterally on the Mark I, and it was causing problems. So I've moved it back as well. And the springs come along this line, in line with these slots. So here's the springs, and this has got some dots on, 5 dots, and that goes at the 5 dot end because it's a longer arm, whereas this is a shorter arm because it just engages the spigot. This goes down the back of the blade, and so the clever thing about the knife is that, you know, when the blade moves back, this pulls the blade back in, and when the slider moves forward, this pulls the blade forward. Only it pulls the blade forward, only the blade doesn't move until this comes forward enough to release the catch, and then the blade flies out then because the spring's tensioned. Similarly, this will pull, this will extend and extend, but the blade won't move until this slope releases the latch, and then the blade flies in. So that's the slider layer. This hole here is for oiling, because I think it will need a little bit of oil, because aluminium on aluminium is not real good, it tends to gall. So with this you can put a drop of oil from the top when it's open, and that'll find its way to the bottom of the slider in order to oil the slider. So the slider goes in there. When we do instructions for assembling the knife, we'll cover off, you know, the installation of the button, but the button's obviously there connected to the slider, so the slider moves up and down in concert with the button. And then layer 6 is what I call the spacer. Layer 6 and layer 7 are the only 2 identical layers, I think, and they provide spacing for the spring diameter. And the spring diameter, I was considering a double spring design, but then it would have been a bit tighter around the button, which comes on this line, and the slot of the button's on this line. But it's important that these come flush or very slightly below the level of the layer 6, because if they don't, then this will slip off. This will slip off the spigot of the blade. If this is too long as well, it'll scratch and cause friction, which means the blade won't fly in. So it's got to be, this has got to be not too thick. If it's too thick, it'll rub against the top layer, and this will rub against the layer beneath the actual blade. It just wants to engage with the spigot and not rub on the blade, because when the blade is flicked in, this doesn't want to be rubbing on the blade, or else it'll stop it getting flicked in. So it turns out that the dimensions of these are quite important. So if this is too thick, it'll rub on the upper layer, and if it's too thin, this will slip off the spigot. So all that took quite a lot of fettling. So we get your 2 spacer layers there, and then you have got your top layer with the slot in, with the slot, and the LR I quite like because it's nice and crisp, but also it reminds me of the LeBlanc Securi nut. What I've got in my mind is the way that was machined on the CNC, and of course it ends up going like that. So that, and obviously all the top heads are recessed for the bolts. All of these bolts at the moment I think are stainless steel, which is actually a bad thing because it tends not to go well in terms of corrosion with aluminium. I did order some M2 2mm black bolts, but they weren't long enough, so I might have to replace those at a later date. But anyway, So that's the way that the layers go together with the blade in, and we'll do another video showing how it actually assembles. I haven't shown the two latches with their springs. They've changed a number of times because they're really critical that they're under a lot of pressure when the spring's on, and they tend to stick at the first opportunity. And then if you make them too light, they don't stick, but then when the blade retracts, it can bounce. I think it can bounce slightly off the end of the knife or off the front of the knife, and then they don't latch, and then the blade's not latched. So that's quite a compromise on those, but hopefully get it right in the end. So yep, that's the way the blade goes together.